Good evening and welcome to another edition of On the Bookshelf. I'm Pete Solomon. We learn history beginning in childhood when we go to school and we learn about America, and then we learn about the world, and then we learn about the various things that happened in the world over our lifetimes and way before. And sometimes we stumble into history and are surprised at what we stumble into. For instance, novelist Jane Healey, who specializes in historical fiction, has written a wonderful book called Good Night from Paris about a true character, a woman named Drew Layton, who emigrates to France, lives in Paris, and finds herself helping in so many ways as someone who is sharing what's going on in Paris with the rest of the world via her radio show, which is beamed back to the United States. Later, she's a strong, staunch supporter of the French resistance, and ultimately, she literally risks her life, not only to stay alive, but to keep the resistance going and to bring the American expatriate women together so that they can be at the forefront as the French take on Hitler and the Nazis. It all comes together in Good Night from Paris by Jane Healey. And we begin with a reading from the book from Jane.
Good Night from Paris is a novel inspired by the true story of a courageous American actress in Nazi-occupied France. Paris, 1939. Hollywood actress Drew Layton, married to Frenchman Jacques Tartier, lives as an expatriate in love. But when her husband is dispatched to Brittany to work as a liaison for the British military, Drew finds herself alone with her housekeeper, adrift and heartsick in her adopted city. With her career and fame 4,500 miles away, Drew accepts an opportunity that will change her life forever. Befriended by seasoned wartime journalist Dorothy Thompson and urged on by political operative Jean Fraise, Drew broadcasts radio programs to the United States. Her duty, shake America from its apathy, and as Nazis encroach and France is occupied, push for resistance and help from the U.S. As Drew and Jean fall under suspicion, Hitler sends his own message. When Drew's adopted country is conquered, she will be executed. In a Paris that is no longer safe, Drew's political passion is ignited. She's prepared to risk anything to fight the enemy, no matter how dangerous. It gets for her, for everyone she loves, and for everything she's fighting for.
Jane Healey, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to discussing your new book, which came out in March of 2023, Good Night from Paris. But at the outset, my request to you is I do not speak a word of French. And the French language is, I think, a very important component of the way you wrote the book. You will see French phrases, we'll see pronunciations of names that we're not familiar with. So please feel free if we get into conversation and I just butcher somebody's name, please just jump in and help. And
that's okay.
I will tell you, as you know, Drew Layton was actually born in Guadalajara. So if we were saying Good Night from Paris or Good Night from Guadalajara, I would do much better. But can't help with the French, and I'm relying on you with that.
Okay.
Looking back at some books that you've written, Secret Stealers is where you tell us that you first learned of Drew's amazing life. And that, of course, is the story of Anne Kavanaugh, a young widow, musical talent, and a spy. And then I read The Beantown Girls, actually, and I really liked it a lot. I plucked it off the shelf because I like period pieces. My dad served in World War II. He didn't talk very much about his experiences. He was not in combat. He worked for Army intelligence and he was decoding things. And stories I remember him telling me were more about life in London, learning how to throw darts and drink warm beer. But that's a wonderful book. Three women, Fiona, Viviana, Dottie, are at a movie one day. They're college graduates. They have their lives in Boston, and they see on the newsreel something about the Red Cross clubmobiles that are traversing Europe. and this sounds exciting to them, and they become involved, they're qualified, and then the story is a fascinating one with some great high points of action. And then Goodnight from Paris, uh, Drew Layden, as you suggested in the open, is an actress, and she is in a play in Europe, in London, and she meets Jacques Chatier, and they fall in love, deeply in love, and marry, and Paris becomes Drew's adopted city. So we're talking about five women, four of whom you created, and one who led a remarkable life. But it seems to me there's a thread that attaches to each of them, and that is their intelligence and their courage, especially under fire. What was it about this period that brought you to your keyboard to write about World War II and about essentially five amazing women?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. You know, my grandfather was in World War II, and he was a firefighter on the Navy ships off the coast of Africa and Europe. And I was very close to him, but like a lot of veterans, he didn't talk a lot about his experiences, which made me more interested, honestly. And also, after writing, my first novel came out in 2017 was The Saturday Evening Girls Club, which is a smaller story in Boston's North End at the turn of the 20th century. And I wanted to write a bigger story. I'd always been fascinated with World War II because of my grandfather. And so with the Beantown Girls, I had learned of the Red Cross Clubmobile program, and these women serving coffee and donuts at the front lines of the war. And it was kind of one of those, like, the hair stands up on the back of your neck. Like, this story is stranger than fiction. Someone must have written a novel about it before, and I looked and I couldn't find any at the time. And so I started digging down into the research, and I was hooked. I was hooked on the story of the Red Cross Clubmobile Girls and all they endured. Most of the stories and the plot lines in the Beantown Girls are based on stories of actual women. As you said, the protagonist and her friends are fictional, but they're really composites of a lot of the real Red Cross Clubmobile women.
When you were growing up, did you have writing either in the back of your mind or maybe in the front of your mind? Did you think you had a future as a published author?
You know, I'd always wanted to be. I always dreamed about being a published author from very young age. It's just sounded like the best job in the world. But you know, I was a pragmatic kid, so I didn't know anyone who just like got out of college and wrote novels and like did fine and could pay off their student loans. So I resisted it for a while, and then when my girls were born, they're 20 and 17 now, and when they were born, I started freelance writing. And you know, it was one of those moments where, like, okay, if you're ever going to take this fiction writing seriously, you actually have to write fiction. You know, you actually have to do it. So that's when I really started taking it seriously.
So, as you went to the University of New Hampshire and graduated with a degree in political science, and then on to graduate school at Northeastern, where you got an MS in counseling, this idea of being a writer was still bouncing around in your head, right?
Yeah, and I really, my initial, you know, I was young going to college, and you know, I went the age at the time you could still go to college. You know, I was 17, I turned 18 the year I went, and as a freshman, and my original path was like, oh, I'll get my PhD and I'll teach at a university. And so like master's degree at Northeastern was the first step towards that. And I was working there on a fellowship and as a teaching assistant. And and then I became kind of disillusioned, and my thought was, oh, I'll teach and I'll write books on the side. Like that was kind of in the back of my head. That was my plan. And then, you know, I realized how hard that was going to be financially, and I wanted to move out of my parents' house, frankly. And it was a big time in tech. There was a real tech boom going on in Boston and Cambridge and all over the world. And I was offered a job as a marketing writer from someone that I worked like 3 different jobs when was in graduate school, and one of them was at a health club, and someone there offered me a job. And so that's how I ended up actually as a product manager in high tech for some time, and then before my daughters were born. And then that's when my husband's still in tech. I realized both of us couldn't work these crazy hours and raise kids and do all of that. So I started freelancing when they were born.
In retrospect, Jane, you're working in the high pressure world of high tech. Obviously, you had deadlines to meet. Later, when you began to write fiction, did these experiences make writing fiction a little easier, or did you have a better sense of what to expect?
Yeah, I think that between like my life in high tech and deadlines, and then freelancing and meeting deadlines, like I realize I respond very well to deadlines, and I still do that. I have to put myself on deadlines sometimes if I'm going to get certain things done with writing. But yeah, that kind of trains you to write to a certain date and time, and kind of map things out in terms of the amount of work you have to get done. I think that's really important.
Do you
So
write
it
every
helps.
day?
I don't. It kind of depends on when I'm on deadline, I definitely write every day. When I'm
Mhm.
not, like now, I'm just working on trying to figure out the next thing. And it's summertime, and my girls need me driving them around and all that stuff. So it's kind of sporadic. But yeah, when I'm on deadline, I write. I really map it out in terms of how many words I have to get done per day. And if I don't get them done like Monday through Friday, then I work all weekend to hit those numbers, because it's stressful, but I feel much better if I'm organized that way. It's kind of organized stress. So
What's the difference putting words in the mouths of women you've created, as opposed to putting dialogue in the mouth of somebody who lived a remarkable life and who was the object of your research? Is that a little different?
it was really different. I mean, one of the things that drew me to Goodnight from Paris and this project was, I think with writing, you always have to push yourself, and biographical fiction, writing about a real person in history as the main character, was a new challenge for me. So I was excited for the challenge, but I have to tell you, like, it was the hardest of the four books, the hardest one by far. And because she was a real person in history, you have to stick to certain parameters of her life if you want to honor her story. And also, you want to get her voice right. And so that was intimidating. And thankfully, two primary sources I used. One, she wrote a very small autobiography after the war about her time during the war. And that really gave me a sense of her voice. It was short, it was only 176 pages, but definitely gave me a sense of her voice and personality. And then I found a number of her letters home that she wrote during the war, when she could still get letters home. They're archived at the Holocaust Museum in DC. They're digitized, so I was able to get those online, and that was another, like, that was a more casual, the way she wrote, and kind of get another aspect of her personality. That was really really helpful as well. So yeah, I mean, but it was very hard, and I put a lot of pressure on myself to get it right. And thankfully, since the books come out, I've been in contact with her grandson and granddaughter, and they were both very happy with the way it was done. So that was a huge relief. So
But you talked about the letters. Now, several chapters begin with letters from Drew going elsewhere, and
yeah,
sometimes they're inserted within chapters. Are they the actual letters that you found, or did you just brush them up a little bit and for the purposes of giving Drew a voice, something that we could match it to with the dialogue? They were fascinating.
thank you. Yeah, no, the letters were all fictional, but they were definitely, some of them, or parts of them, were based on some of the letters that her and Jacques wrote to each other over time. But they were fictional. I like kind of using letters as a device to kind of, particularly when there's time jumps, things like that. I think it's a good device to kind of, and it also gives a different perspective on the characters sometimes. So that's why I like to use that.
Jane, sometimes it takes time for a book to find its rhythm. This is not one of those times. This book started out at the bottom of the coaster and then rose up, and then we were all flying.
Thank you.
Is this something when you laid things out, when you thought about what the finished product was going to be after you wrote it, is this something you were thinking about to introduce us to Drew and then get going?
Yeah, I've talked a lot about this with other authors. I think that we're in a time of where, people's focus and concentration are, there's a lot of different mediums. They can be online, they can be on TikTok, they can be watching streaming movies. And so I think that you have to really get in the story right away, from page one, chapter one.
Mhm.
And they have to be well paced and relatively short chapters. And I really, one thing I learned after it took me so long to write my first novel is pay before I start really digging into the story and writing, I pay a lot of attention to structure and narrative structure, and whether it's a 3 act structure, or there's lots of different kinds of structures, but I pay a lot of attention to that, to kind of make sure that every scene, every moment has a purpose, in the story. Nothing is extra, something in every scene moves the narrative along, and hopefully more than one thing in the scene does.
You suggested as you began your reading that Drew is in fact a film star. And
Mhm.
I believe she made, in my research, I believe she made 9 films. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact number. I think some of them in her beginning of the career, were really bit roles. The
Mhm.
ones that she's most known for are the Charlie Chan films, where she was like the blonde sidekick. There's a lot of excerpts on YouTube and stuff that you can see. So that was kind of when her star was on the rise. She never kind of achieved A-list status, but I would say the Charlie Chan films, she was kind of getting there. She was on the movie posters. She, all of that kind of stuff. That was when she was starting to, her stardom was starting to grow finally.
Well, instantly from the very beginning, you know that Drew is a very intelligent, self-possessed woman. And when people early in the book recognize her from her work on screens in the United States, she's very modest about her acting ability, despite the fact that she's a successful actress. But she's very beautiful, and I don't mean this in a pejorative. She knows she's an attractive woman. She doesn't use it, but she understands that this is a gift she's been given. And I thought that was interesting because so many times you meet people in any walk of life, and if people suggest that their beauty is a big factor in their lives, they say, "Oh no, not me." But she knows who she is, doesn't she?
Oh, yes, yes. And that was one. Thank you for saying that that came across, because that was important to me. She was not a shrinking violet. She was well aware of that she was a beautiful woman, and a successful actress. Like you said, I mean, not obnoxiously arrogant about it, but definitely self-possessed.
Mm-hmm. And that really gave us insight to her character.
Yes.
Now, she's living in Paris. You can hear the drums of the war approaching. And although she has maybe more safe options, she's committed to living in Paris, even when her husband Jacques, as you mentioned earlier, is liaison, goes off, and they are separated, and she often does not know where he is. But she's going to stay in Paris, even though her best friends are telling her, look, you have an opportunity to go back to Hollywood, some money. When this is all over, you and Jacques will get back together. You live wherever you want. And that was something she was very committed to. The people of Paris and the people of France were very important to her. I'm thinking, because you speak French and because of the way the book is structured, you have a special feeling for the French, don't you?
I do. I do. I only speak a few words, on quite honestly. My husband's fluent. He speaks French beautifully. He lived there for a time. And so when I finally got to go there, 20 years ago, I just fell in love with it. And I still am. And I hope that came across in the book. I think Paris is kind of like another character in the story in some ways. And yeah, it's definitely has a special place in my heart for sure.
So Drew is all alone now. Jacques has moved on in his work as a liaison. And she is going to stay in Paris. And she stumbles into a great opportunity of broadcasting via shortwave to the United States. She's asked to do this because the U.S. is playing a neutral role at this point. This is a part you don't read a lot about in the history books, but from her perspective, you understand that she is trying to tell her fellow Americans, this is real and it's coming and it could spread, and we really need your help. And because of her intelligence and her attitude and her film experience, she transitions into this position as a radio broadcaster very well, doesn't she?
She does. She really embraces the role, and becomes quite passionate about it. And in the beginning, it was a lot of kind of light cultural programming about like a day in the life of a French family and things like that. But yeah, that's one thing I really wanted to get across. America was quite isolationist in 1939. They wanted nothing to do with another world war. They were war weary. They thought that this is a European problem, and to a person in the research, I found any American expatriate living in France knew that Americans' involvement was inevitable, knew how bad things were and how things were deteriorating across the continent. And of course, the Ambassador Bullitt, who was a friend, he was the American ambassador in Paris and a friend of Drew's. Was one of the most vocal proponents of saying, the U.S., begging the U.S. for help, begging Roosevelt for help, but it took a while, obviously, for America to get involved.
The journalist Dorothy Thompson, who is a real journalist and who came out of Syracuse University and began doing things that women just weren't doing in that era.
Right.
They have a good rapport. And Dorothy, I guess, in a journalistic sense, is sort of a mentor to Drew, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and so that first kind of act one of the book where Drew is working in radio. That was a black box in her life in terms of my research. I looked everywhere for transcripts or recordings of her radio shows. I wanted to try to understand why the Nazis put out a bounty on her head for doing this radio programming. And from what I found, those transcripts and recordings were all destroyed. Probably for a reason. When Paris was occupied, I think the radio station itself just destroyed everything. So I really had to kind of to call it together, like figure out, well, what happened, who did she interview, who was on the program, and Dorothy Thompson was a name that kept coming up, and she was really extraordinary. She was a international journalist for America working in Berlin during the 30s and was one of the first journalists to ever interview Hitler. And she saw him and saw what was coming very early on. You read some of her writings from the 1930s, and in fact, she was so vocal about how dangerous this man was that he kicked her out of Germany. And so she was working in Europe still, and I had to think that she was on the show, she was on the programs with Drew more than once. She had to have been a big influence in terms of broadcasting what was really happening in Europe, with Hitler and with the Nazis, and the horrors of it. So yeah, I knew she had to be a character, and she's another kind of unsung American hero, I think, from that time period that people need to know more about.
Now, that's the first part of the book, correct? And now suddenly bombs are raining down on Paris. The Nazis
Yeah.
arrived, and people are involved in a mass exodus to get out of the city where it's dangerous. And they come together, especially the American women who are living in Paris, and their camaraderie, their ability to understand what's about to happen is impressive to the French people, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the American women, the expatriates that were living there, got involved with helping the refugees that were pouring in from Berlin, until things got so bad in Paris that pretty much everyone fled the city initially. But yeah, a lot of the expatriates got involved in trying to help refugees, trying to feed Parisians when Drew was outside of the city, trying to get food to her friends who were starving because food was getting more and more scarce within the city. So yeah, there was a lot of American women there who got involved in helping whatever way they could.
The bombing creates this desperation. These people leave, find places elsewhere. They're desperate. And then suddenly their desperation grows. How does one author write desperation?
You know, that's yeah, and thank you for saying that. I think that you know, trying to create that tension and that feeling, I really relied on not just Drew's perspective of what was happening, but there's a lot of other sources, books and different things about what the French people were going through as you know in June of 1940 when the Germans were started marching down the streets of Paris and occupied and what that felt like and you read about these families who are fleeing the city with whatever they can carry and with you know they're taking elderly people in baby carriages and they're you know they have carts with everything they own you know and so I really relied on you know first person perspectives that I read about in history to try to give a sense of that desperation and that tension and that what is going to happen next you know
The reaches a crescendo when Drew has to use her acting skills literally save her own life. That's a fascinating part of the book, and the tension is palpable.
Oh, thank you, yeah, I mean not to give too much away but yes that she really she had to rely on her acting skills and her gumption and she was quite stubborn about saving her own life. She was yeah she you know which in some ways nearly killed her because she was so you know she took things too far but yes yeah and it's
And
extraordinary that it's a true story. I mean that was all true you know.
and one of the things that's extraordinary, Jane, is luck of the draw. She encounters people who are willing to help her at the risk of their lives.
Yes.
It's an amazing coterie of people around her who help her survive.
Yeah, so you know, I am in part of the story. There's they rounded up several hundred American women and imprisoned them, and you know, Drew was determined to get out of there. And this Jewish doctor who was trying to save his own family by working in this prison, this internment camp for American and British women, they he was generous enough to help her, even though he knew he was already in danger. His family was already in danger. He was terrified of the doctors that he worked with and that were German. And yet he was compassionate towards these women and understood Drew's desperation and need to get out and help with the resistance back in Barbizon, which is the village outside of Paris where she ended up relocating. So yeah, I mean you know it speaks to just the power of the human spirit, and you just wonder if you would be strong enough to do these things that some of these people did during the war.
Jane, Good Night from Paris is a testament to intelligence, courage, to camaraderie, and to bravery. It's a wonderful piece of work and a book that will live in my head for a long time. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for visiting with us.
Oh, and thank you for such kind words. I really that means everything to me. And thank you for this wonderful interview. You're so well prepared. Thank you for all your questions.
Thank you. Best of luck with your next work, and hopefully we can do this again when the next one is published.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for your visit to On the Bookshelf.